Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert D. Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I'll try to answer the question, is our universe a computer simulation or something to that effect? Now, you've probably noticed that this question has been asked quite frequently in the recent couple of years. People like Elon Musk or Neil deGrasse Tyson or other like popular media figures, they like openly ask it, right? So it's a question that is very frequently mentioned in modern media discourse, like quasi-scientific media discourse, I should add. So this modern wave of this sort of thinking is actually goes back to early 2000s, where in particular, a Swedish philosopher, Nick Bostrom, or Boström, or how would they pronounce it, was developing this idea, etc. But it gains more and more popularity, and hopefully you can see it. Well, actually, hopefully you don't see it, but I think you see it anyway. All right. So I'll give you my answer to this question later, but first, to kind of logically proceed to this answer, I wish to elucidate what I think are historical and cultural roots of this question and this whole line of thinking in the first place. So I would claim that this idea is really old, and this new iteration of it is just a icing on the cake, as you say in English. In particular, like I wouldn't even discuss all these hypothetical ancient Indian or Chinese or Aztec or whatever religions. Rather, I would focus on our Christian thinking, like Western world type Christian thinking, because I think it's much more relevant to us than some mythical, legendary Indian texts written by British spies in the middle of the 19th century. All right, so in the Bible, which probably was written also, well, I don't know, depends on your worldview, I don't know, maybe 15th century, who knows. Anyway, it's embedded in our culture, so let's discuss the Bible. So in John 1:1, it is said that in the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, etc., etc. So in the beginning was the Word. These are the key words here. Again, a little bit of tautology, as is frequent on this channel recently. So what this says essentially, in my eye, is that, or ear, is that people recognized at certain point in history that, or maybe a certain bunch of points in history, is that words are really powerful. With words you can change reality, like you can govern other people, for example, which would do stuff and change reality through their agency, so to speak. So anyway, words are powerful. Therefore, maybe everything was created through a word or by a word. So this is the idea behind this statement. Now, I know that word is logos actually in the original. I mean, the original of the New Testament is in Greek. So, like maybe, but I'll return to that word logos near the end. Okay, so we'll talk about words so far. Okay, that was like the antiquity, so to speak, this religious hegemony of religion, as I called it in the previous video, right? But now we have this new cultural reality where not only do we have books, either handwritten or printed or whatever was the reality back then. Well, I mean, supposedly the Bible was spread by handwritten texts, but well, okay, that's a separate discussion. Anyway, now we have a new cultural reality where not only do we have words either spoken or printed or written, now we have computers, right? We have the internet. We basically spend like, I don't know, well, depends on the person, but like maybe a third of their life interacting with computers that way or another, this form of computer or another. We have virtual reality, we have all those kinds of things, right? So we are almost like halfway into the virtual world, basically, into the computer world. So now we recognize, in the previous stage, people recognize that words are powerful, therefore maybe everything started with a word. And now we recognize that computers are powerful, so maybe everything started with a computer. Maybe everything was created by a computer. So it's a clear analogy, like speech or language. When it was invented, then there was this idea that maybe God created everything with the word, or even God was created with the word. Then, now, in our new cultural reality, we have programming languages or computer codes, and the same idea emerges. Maybe computer is the creator, so maybe everything comes from the computer code, from programming language, right? And I would claim that it's more than analogy. Like, it's basically the very same idea, like all the bones and, how do you say it, meat in English. There's probably no such expression in English, but anyway, it's the very same idea, just purely transplanted into other cultural soil, our modern cultural soil. It's a certain attempt, a subconscious maybe attempt, but it's, you know, kind of the same cultural codes, or even biological codes perhaps, manifesting in a new cultural reality, right? It's an attempt to modernize God in certain sense, turn him or her, whichever, or it, whichever you prefer, into a computer, basically. And one short comment I wish to make here is that obviously, like, the recent interest in this theory, and even this Nick Bostrom's guy interest in this theory, was influenced, I mean, obviously, just if you look at the dates, by the movie Matrix from 1999, because it had so much impact on culture that it's really hard to imagine. Although on the same topic, I'm almost sure you didn't watch it, but so I recommend you to watch it. The other movie, Virtual Nightmare from 2000. I think it was filmed like simultaneously with Matrix. It just didn't make it before it. So it's not influenced by Matrix, as far as I know, but I might be mistaken. So it's like a different branch of the same idea, but I actually prefer this different branch, although I acknowledge the huge impact of Matrix, and I like it also, but I like Virtual Nightmare more. Okay. Anyway, so that was just a short intermission. So, with regards to God, like, if we compare these two lines of thinking, lines of reasoning, like the Word / God as a creator of everything, versus the computer code / supercomputer as the creator of everything, right? So, with regards to God, again, we have a long tradition, at least several centuries of tradition of people dealing with that. So, we already had agnostics in like 18th to 19th century, like people like David Hume, people like Immanuel Kant, people like Huxley, who has shown, again, agnostics, who has shown that it is impossible, basically, to prove or disprove the existence of God, right? So they said this question of existence of God is irrelevant, essentially, because you can prove that God exists, you can disprove that God exists. So the question itself is irrelevant. It doesn't matter, right? In some sense, it is equivalent. Like, if God exists or if God doesn't exist, the result doesn't change. So who cares, basically? That was their conclusion, not their initial stance. But anyway, I would propose to use the same approach to this idea, whether the world is a simulation and whether a giant supercomputer stands or sits or lies down behind all the world, right? So yeah, it is irrelevant. This question of whether the universe is a simulation or not is irrelevant and meaningless and futile. That would be my, well, sort of a quasi, almost a conclusion. Like you might say, well, but wait a minute. Like in science, I mean, supposedly we're still in the realm of science, right? So, because it's all those scientific guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who actually has nothing to do with science, or Elon Musk, who also has nothing to do with science. He's into engineering, which is a completely different thing. So, they all talk about science. So, maybe we can answer this question through science. Well, okay, let's use the best criterion we have, which is the criterion of falsifiability in science. I mean, Karl Popper, etc., etc. Okay, I've already given the criticism of the criterion of falsifiability in previous videos. Basically, I claim that it's not viable. You can still... I'm not sure I need to go into another digression, but okay, let me give a short digression about falsifiability. So, falsifiability doesn't work in science because, as I've claimed in other videos, science doesn't seek for truth, it constructs objects. So, if you say, my theory is falsified by this and this and this, can be falsified, then you observe this and this and this, but you say, but maybe there exists another object that allows this and this and this to exist, and my theory is still to be correct. Like again, dark matter is an example that I give. Like like the rotation curves of galaxies falsify Newtonian gravitation, but people say, F you, Newtonian gravitation is correct. We just need to introduce new object, dark matter, and everything is hunky-dory then with Newtonian gravitation. Okay, end with this digression. So, let's try using this falsifiability, which doesn't work, but it's the best we have with science. So, let's try to falsify the existence of this supercomputer that emulates, simulates, whatever, the universe, the world. So, how can we falsify the existence of this supercomputer? Well, we can say, if there exists, well, it actually more like verify, but well, it's actually kind of hard. I'm not even sure. But anyway, okay, let's jump to the simpler criterion, which is even weaker than the criterion of falsifiability, which is the criterion of verifiability. Let's say that we want to verify that there is some other world, like more fundamental than our world, which is only a simulation. So in this fundamental world, there is the supercomputer that is modeling our fictitious world where we live in, so to speak, right? So, how can we verify the existence of this world? Well, we can say that if there exists some feedback, so between our world and the more fundamental world, then it would mean that the more fundamental world exists. Like we are in touch with it somehow, right? Because if there's no such feedback, like we're completely cut out of this more fundamental world, then indeed this question doesn't have any sense. Like it is completely irrelevant, right? Because, well, how can we know about any fundamental world, more fundamental world, if we don't have any access to it? We can't. So agnostics win. 1-0. Agnostics versus simulationists, so to speak. But if there exists some connection, like if we can influence this more fundamental world, at least in some way, then we can tell that it definitely exists, right? All right, let's adopt this point of view. But then you immediately encounter another problem that, well, let's say you did something, like how can we detect this feedback? You probably should do something and like wait for a response from this external more fundamental world. And you would suddenly see that response. You would say, hey, I found something. If I do this thing, they respond from the other side of the screen, so to speak. But the problem is, the problem that you would immediately encounter, if you think at least a little bit about it, is that all these anomalies, so to speak, that shouldn't exist in our world, which is a simulation, but come to our world from this more fundamental world, so we perceive them as anomalies because they shouldn't exist in our world, they would still be perceived as a part of our world. That's the problem, you see. Again, see my video about logical cosmology where I talk about it. Like you define the universe, like the best definition of universe I can think about is all the things we can interact with. So if we can interact with this portion, let's say, of this more fundamental world, we would perceive, at least if we are reasonable, it as also the part of our universe. So we wouldn't perceive it as anything else, like as any other layer of reality, so to speak. So this is the problem. It's a huge problem for this worldview of world as a simulation, etc. So yeah, and if you don't believe me, again, science, kind of returning a little bit back, science constructs objects. So if you perceive an anomaly, you just, a scientist, a normal scientist, and I'm not saying normal in a good sense, I'm just stating the obvious that that's what a normal, typical scientist would do. If they observe anomaly, they try to introduce new objects. And again, I've talked about this in my video, potential energy and other dark matters, and possibly some other videos. So anyway, if you don't believe me that this is what would happen, you can right now, again, try and reverse this example. Like I've already said that the idea of God and the Word producing the world, and the idea of a computer and the computer code producing the world are identical. So you can exchange them right now for the sake of this argument and say, well, let us observe the anomalies in our world that we know about. Like we definitely know that these anomalies exist because, well, the previous argument was that through anomalies we can verify that there is some other metaphysical, whatever, extra physical reality behind our world. So what kind of anomalies we observe? And again, we can use the same example of dark matter. So you observe that the galaxies disobey physical laws as we know them, right? As we constructed them, if you follow my videos. So the galaxies rotate differently than we would expect from our laws of physics. So what we can conclude from that? Well, this is an anomaly, right? It's something that shouldn't exist in our world, yet it does. So what we can conclude from that is that God exists. God damn. Well, God exists and goddamn kind of dissonant, right? But anyway, so you might even bring forth such an argument like, well, if the galaxies were rotating according to Newton, according to the matter we observe, they would fall apart. Therefore, we wouldn't exist. But God wants us to exist, so the God interferes into the rotation of galaxies, into the laws of Newton, and he says, F you, rotate as I've said. So the galaxies obey and they rotate as we observe. So, yeah, this proves the existence of God. You don't need dark matter, like, hey, forget about it. Well, I agree that we don't need dark matter, but it's a completely different subject. But, like, my argument here is that, again, as I've already said, like, it was just an example to illustrate to you that we would treat any anomalies that we observe as parts of our universe. We wouldn't assume that they prove an existence of any other reality, so to speak. So dark matter is not assumed to be a part of another more fundamental universe, right? It's assumed to be a part of our universe. So whatever you observe the most natural response and the most correct, I would claim, response is to like perceive that as part of our universe rather than more some hypothetical, more fundamental universe. So even this criterion of verifiability, so to speak, of, you know, the existence of this more fundamental reality with this monstrous hypercomputer in it simulating our universe, is failing. It's impossible. Like, it's impossible to prove. It's impossible to perceive, because if you actually sit on those rails, so to speak, where it is possible, you can prove the existence of God easily. And again, unfortunately, agnostics already showed that you cannot prove the existence of God in this manner. Sorry. So yeah. Well, that was. Hopefully, it made some sense. I'm not sure. Like it was. I was just running in circles here. But yeah. So my point is, yeah, that the question is irrelevant, and well, okay, I'll return to this later. I wish to return to the thing I've mentioned at the beginning, that, you know, this word versus logos, which is the same in the Bible text, right? So, I mean, it's translated as word, whereas it's actually logos. So, what I wish to elucidate here, hopefully, is that logos, like this line of reasoning where word creates the world, I kind of like how these words are similar, or a computer code, which is also kind of a set of words, signs at least, creates a world. It's this line of reasoning of, you know, logos creates chaos, because the world is chaos, essentially, or at least like it's full of chaos, let's say. But the word is something full of meaning, right? It's something, logos, it's order, it's like super highly structurized, whereas the world is a bunch of stuff that's going on, so it's full of chaos. So this line of reasoning that logos creates chaos, it's the foundation of religion and metaphysics, if you think about it. So yeah, in religion and metaphysics, everything is full of meaning, everything is full of sense, at least in the most refined manner. So if you distill, so to speak, sublimate the world, you would get like this pure meaning, pure point, pure sense. Everything is full of this sense. It's just that the sense is covered into this dirt of chaos, right? You just have to recognize it in this dirt. But dirt is something external with regards to logos, etc. Okay, so yeah, so we only have these shadows of meaning in the actual world that we perceive with our senses, let's say. So we have to intellectually extract the meaning, but the meaning is more fundamental than the dirt around it. That's what this line of reasoning tells us. Like, again, logos, from logos comes chaos. This is the line of reasoning I'm talking about. And this is the line of reasoning that leads to this understanding, or rather perspective of how the God created the world, and maybe itself from the word, or a supercomputer created the world from computer code, etc., and maybe even itself. Well, I don't know. But my position here is exactly the opposite, is that it's actually chaos produces logos. So this logos, this order, is secondary with respect to chaos. And so words and meaning are secondary products of chaos organizing itself. So yeah. So I'm like fundamentally opposing this other idea, So words and meaning are secondary, and even more so, they're local. They're very localized, like only certain interpreter or narrator, if you remember my video about nature of knowledge. If you don't, you might watch it again. So this interpreter or narrator has their own perspective, and they impose their own meaning, narrator's meaning, into other things. So they, in some sense, construct this meaning based on their own position in this whole mess of power ensembles, basically. That's what I'm saying. So the meaning is secondary, whereas in this other perspective, like religious / simulationists perspective, the meaning is actually preceding the chaos rather than following from it. And again, in the same video, Nature of Knowledge, I've shown, hopefully, how the history, what was the history of emergence of this view that I talk about as my view. You know, this view that it's actually the interpretations and stories are come first, like, or rather, there is no absolute meaning. Probably that would be a better way to express it. So there are meanings, but they depend on where you stand, right? Where you look from. So points of view differ because they are different points. So you view different things, you focus on different things, you construct different objects, etc., etc. Well, again, I'm sorry it sounds too abstract, but hopefully it's at least a bit understandable. So Logos creates chaos. It's a religious point of view. It's a point of view of people who talk about the world as a simulation, which is, again, irrelevant and rubbish in my opinion. Whereas chaos produces logos in certain areas of its existence. It's my point of view. And therefore, like, no, it doesn't work the other way, you know. Yeah, so that's what I would say is happening. All right. So to conclude this rant, I would say that the question of whether the universe is a computer simulation or not is irrelevant, and it's the same type of thinking. I mean, this question follows from the same, like, exact same type of thinking that produced God in the first place. I mean, people who were indulging in this type of thinking produced God, who apparently created the world with word, etc. But here, the universe is a computer simulation. The universe is produced not by word of God, but by a code of a computer. And it's the same type of thinking. And the same type of rebuttal is fitting to this type of thinking as the rebuttal that was fitting for the question of existence of God by agnostics, at least at face value, what they said, right? So nor the existence nor the non-existence of this hypothetical supercomputer standing behind the universe is possible. So yeah, the question is irrelevant, just as the question of the existence of God. So yeah, but as a bonus to this video, which, like, I understand it wasn't the best of my videos, like I was really walking in circles, sort of. So as a bonus, I propose you to, whenever this question, how do you say it, bubbles up in some discussion, you can tell those supposedly scientific types, whoever promote this idea that the world is a simulation, that they're just talking about God. Like, you just tell them right away that, you know, your hypothetical supercomputer that executes hypothetical code is the same as the God, hypothetical God, telling the hypothetical word that produces the world. And it would piss them off, and you would enjoy that. At least I would have enjoyed that. All right. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.